Hey there, ladies, gentlemen, and persons in between. Today we're going to talk about cognitive biases as they relate to political discourse. I know, you're already all kinds of hot and bothered, aren't you? My name's Tim Snowborn, and this is another episode of Serious Issues. So, last time I talked about logical fallacies as they relate to political discourse, but I feel like it's also important to talk about cognitive biases for the same reason. Cognitive bias, you probably know what bias means. Cognitive bias is just a bias in your thinking. It's a repeated mistake in the way you think about, evaluate, and remember things, usually as a result of clinging to your previously held beliefs despite new and contrary information. I recently came across an article about cognitive biases. I'll put a link in the description. I encourage you to read it. It's a fascinating list. And again, I want to point out that these are things that both conservatives and liberals are guilty of. Again, as a liberal, I tend to think that conservatives suffer from these biases more than liberals do, or at least more than I do, but that's probably just one of my biases. So, in no particular order, here are 10 cognitive biases that I frequently encounter in my discussions about politics. The most common bias that I probably come across is the confirmation bias. This is when you tend to believe sources that agree with your opinion and tend to be skeptical of sources that contradict your opinion. A great example here is conspiracy theorists. Conspiracy theorists always have their own sources for what they believe. They think they have qualified sources to back up their claims too, which is why it's so hard to convince them otherwise. Another example, and one of my favorite conspiracy theories, is that Hillary Clinton is to Satan what Emperor Palpatine is to Darth Vader. Sorry guys, Hillary Clinton is not the devil's sensei. You cannot judge a person entirely by the bad things they've done and ignore the good things. Another great example is that many conservatives believe that the media has a liberal bend to it except for Fox News. Another fairly common one is the attentional bias, and this is pretty closely related to the confirmation bias. It's not about agreeing with sources that agree with you and being skeptical of those that don't. It's just you notice some things and don't notice others. A great example here is bad news in the media. A lot of people think that the world is a deep, dark place and people are basically evil because they watch the news and see murder, rape, robbery, war, death, and horror. But that's just the things that you notice. You're forgetting about the things that you don't see here. The reason it's so easy to point to the bad news and say that the world is going to hell is because the bad news stands out in such stark contrast against the backdrop of everyday kindness and peace. The media likes to point out the bad news because it's unusual, it's abnormal. What you're not seeing is all the good things that happen every day, and all the times that something bad could have happened but didn't, which is a lot. Next we have the negativity bias, and again this is pretty closely related to the confirmation bias and the attentional bias. The negativity bias states that we tend to give more psychological weight to bad news than good news. So again, you see murder, rape, robbery, death, and horror in the news, and you think that's all that happens in the world, and that's not true. You're just not seeing the good news, which happens a lot more often. Another one that I couldn't help putting in as I looked over the list of cognitive biases is the conservatism bias. This is the inability to change one's mind in light of new information. A common example here is that marijuana is far less dangerous than alcohol. You can tell that to a lot of prohibitionists and they will never change their minds. They just won't believe you. Same way you can tell pro-lifers that Planned Parenthood prevents more abortions than it provides. Nope, still gotta shut down Planned Parenthood, don't we? Time for another magic trick. Perhaps the greatest example, though, is gun control. Literally nothing will change a person's mind about gun control if they're against it. You can tell them that for every criminal killed by a privately owned firearm, at least 30 innocent lives are taken. Won't shake them. You can tell them that even the NRA admits that you are very unlikely to ever need or use your gun. Won't change their minds. You can tell them that having a gun in your home actually makes you less safe because you're more likely to shoot yourself or one of your family members or friends. Nope, still not going to change your mind. Another common bias is the reactance bias. This is when you reject another person's opinion out of hand because you think that they're trying to control you. Great example here is that conservatives tend to reject liberal ideas because liberals, and liberals tend to reject conservative ideas because conservatives. Conservatives tend to think that any idea a liberal has must automatically be bad and vice versa. For example, conservatives, at least in Massachusetts, loved Obamacare when it was Romneycare. But as soon as the idea came out of Obama's mouth, then it was the worst thing ever. Next, we have perhaps the most insidious bias of them all, and that's the blind spot bias. This is the belief that your opinions are objective and everyone else is biased. It's the belief that only you have an unbiased opinion and everyone else is influenced by something or wrong in some way. This is something I suspect almost every person talking about politics is guilty of. Almost everyone thinks that their opinion, until you bring this bias up and point it out, almost everyone thinks that they are the only unbiased person. Or, again, confirmation bias. If someone agrees with you, then their opinion is unbiased. But if someone disagrees with you, then they are obviously biased, right? Then there's the second most insidious bias on the list, and that's the projection bias. This is the belief that other people think like we do. We tend to think that most people agree with us. A great example here is feminism for me. Do I consider myself a feminist? Well, no, in the sense that when I think of a feminist, I think of someone who's more active in promoting the cause than I am. But yes, in the sense that I naturally believe that women should be treated as equals. Of course they should. Are there people out there who don't think this? The answer is unfortunately yes. There are a lot of people who don't think women should be treated as equals. Not just in other parts of the world either. There are many men in America who think that women should not be treated as equals. And that's bizarre. Sex without consent is rape. Of course it is. Obviously. Are there people that need to be told this? Well, yeah. Unfortunately, there are. It's mind-blowing to think that anyone needs to be told that sex without consent is rape, but here we are. Gay people are just as emotionally healthy as straight people. Obviously. People disagree with this? Yeah, actually a lot of people disagree with that. I don't understand it, but next we have the availability cascade. This is the idea that if you repeat something often enough, it becomes accepted as the truth. The greatest example here is they're coming to take your guns. The NRA repeats this to gun owners all the time, and sadly, most gun owners seem to believe it. It hasn't been true since they started saying it decades ago, and it's still not true today. Tax cuts create jobs. Nope. I realize that 2008 is a long time ago and we've already forgotten about it, but it's still not true that tax cuts create jobs. We've tried it. Ask Kansas. Then there's the idea that we spend more on welfare than anything else. Nope, not true at all. The greatest consumer of your tax dollars is by far the military. By far and away. The military is at least half of our spending. Next, we have the frequency bias. This is the idea that something you just noticed is happening all the time, or that it's happening more than it did. The example I'm going to use here is the idea that cops are shooting unarmed black people left and right. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that's not happening, of course it is. I'm not saying that it isn't a problem, of course it is. The bias that I'm talking about here is that cops have probably been shooting unarmed black people left and right before we started to notice it. The difference now is that we just have more cameras catching them in the act. I also think this gives the impression that most cops are racist, and although the FBI did warn us about white supremacist groups infiltrating the police force, I still think that's not true. I honestly think that most cops are basically good people who are just trying to make their communities better. Finally, there's the fundamental attribution error. That's the idea that there's only one possible explanation for something. Great example here is that the only possible reason a person would ever be on welfare is because they're just too lazy to work. Nope, there are as many different reasons to be on welfare as there are people on welfare. The vast majority of welfare recipients are either very young, very old or permanently disabled. Sometimes those disabilities are physical, but usually they're psychological. There's quite a lot of people on welfare that have a mental illness they're not getting treated for, either because it's undiagnosed or because they can't afford treatment. Another example is the idea that terrorists hate us for our freedom. No, they mostly hate us for our foreign policy. They mostly want us to stay the fuck out of their business. Now, I understand sometimes we do have to get involved in their business to prevent further business from happening, but the point is they don't hate us because we're free. There are a lot of countries that are as free as we are, and the terrorists don't bother them nearly as much. Another great example is the idea that the only reason a woman ever gets an abortion is because she's irresponsible and just wants to keep partying. I'm positive that's what the majority of pro-lifers think. They think there's no other reason a woman would get an abortion. Never mind anything about the health and well-being of the mother. They don't understand that some abortions were wanted pregnancies. They wanted the baby, but they had to get an abortion because of, again, health and well-being of the mother. Nope, that virtually never happens, right? So, there you have it, 10 cognitive biases that I commonly encounter in my political discussions. I'm sure you've heard at least some of these yourself. Do any of you have a favorite cognitive bias? Like I said last time, conservative viewers, please point out a case in which liberals are guilty of these cognitive biases. I've tried to point those out myself, but I'm sure you've got many more examples. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, share, and like. My name is Tim Snowborn, and this has been another episode of Serious Issues.